Welcome, everyone, to the HB Global Employee Ownership Podcast Series. Today, we have a really great conversation between CEO of HB Global, Bob Whalen, and Senior Vice President of People and Culture, Stacy Baum, where Bob's going to be telling us a little bit about the evolution of his leadership journey, focusing on some topics such as autonomy, accountability, decentralization, and more. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. We recognize this podcast is available to the general public, but we just want to say that the views expressed in it are in the context of HB Global and may not apply to broader audiences. One more clarifying point before we get started. When Bob discusses BBEC a few minutes into the podcast, it's worth noting that BBEC joined HB Global in 2018, but has been an ESOP since 2000, celebrating 25 years of participation. Employees that have crossed the $1 million threshold have worked at BBEC since prior to the acquisition by HB Global. With that, Stacy, take it away.
Hi, Bob. Thanks for joining me today on the podcast and making some time to talk about some topics that have been, I'll say, a key focus for you over the last 9 to 12 months.
Glad to be here.
So I wanted to start just hearing a little bit from your perspective of how your leadership has changed over the last 15 years since you started HB Global and joined HB McClure.
Yeah, I think it's changed a lot. So in a lot of different forms, I think I've talked about the story, but really back when I joined HB McClure, I was looking for an opportunity to run an organization, a quarterback an organization. It was a lot about me. It was I had worked my way up the corporate ladder, and I really wanted to get a shot for me to run something. And it wasn't like that I wasn't a good teammate, and that I wasn't that I didn't get fulfillment or joy out of helping others in my career. But I think the acquisition of HB McClure was 90% about me and what I wanted to accomplish in my career, and maybe 10% about others. And really, as time has evolved, I think that coin has really flipped. And it all started with us becoming an ESOP. And I've described that in the past as it was first a financial transaction that that we were in a difficult time because of the economy, and we went looking for a solution, and it perfectly aligns with the culture that I was trying to build at HB McClure. But really, was a response to that. And as we got to be an ESOP, it really transformed me to, it being a tool in my toolbox to really becoming my professional mission, in what I was doing. And, I now, every year when the values come out, I'm, excited to see what values are and, who's our latest millionaire, because we've started to create millionaires now, in large part because of the employees at BBEC that have been with us for now 24 years. And next year we'll have our 25th anniversary, and every single employee that was there when we started has now crossed the $1 million value, threshold. And it's just, I would have never dreamt that it would transform, me so much. I think, some of the stuff was there, but it was, really transformative, and has made my career just, so much more rewarding.
There are certainly some things that I think have been consistent messaging for you over the last 15 years. And one of those has been a decentralized model. I think it's certainly something that sets the organization apart. So just curious your thoughts on how that continued thought process of the importance of a decentralized model goes hand in hand with your messaging around autonomy, and now more recently, radical autonomy.
So it is really important to me, the decentralized model. And I think that predominantly came out of my experiences where I worked for very large companies prior to coming to HB McClure, and seeing some of them really try to manage the company from a centralized location, be very hierarchical.
Yeah.
And I saw how that just did not work. It really didn't embrace the power you got out of your employee base. And so over time, that became a cornerstone of how I felt that you best led an organization, was from a decentralized model. And our business really lends itself to it. Mechanical contracting is really a local business for the most part. And so to have business leaders and teams in the market that know their market, know the best way to go about that market, know the resources they need to execute the service that they're going to provide in that market, which is very different.
Right.
If you look at our businesses, they're very different in the service that we provide to our customers. They're in the best position to do that, and we can give advice from the outside. We can challenge our businesses to look at things a little differently. But when push comes to shove, we want to have leaders in place that we trust, that are going to do the best by the business in what they need to do. And for the large part, that has played out, for us. And it really led me to start thinking about, how do you articulate the model for which you want to operate. And that's where radical autonomy came from. It was pulling all the things together, the things that I saw pretty naturally and how I wanted this to operate. And then there was a few stragglers, that we, brought into the model late, that I think are extremely, critical. And so we view, radical autonomy as getting decisions as close to the customer, as you can. Though the autonomy to make those decisions should be granted to you by your supervisors. So supervisors should make an active decision to push that decision down. And then the last really important piece is to hold the person that's responsible, accountable for results. Because while we think we have a mission that's really important, it takes producing real results to make that mission come alive. And so that accountability piece of what everybody has to do in the system, I think, is really important. And again, really my thoughts on leadership in large part came out of team sports and how the best team sports operate. And I think that that's an important part of the greatest teams. You watch the greatest teams, they hold each other accountable for it. The people that are responsible take responsibility. When they talk to the media after the game, if they made a bad play, they take responsibility for it, and, they're happy, to accept the congratulations when they did great things too, but it's this whole piece that I think leads to the best results.
And I know you live by our core values, and you challenge all of our business leaders to live by them and to hold their teams accountable to them. How do you think that translates when we're acquiring businesses and we're trying to get people engaged in the culture?
Well, I think first and foremost, I think, our four core values resonate to the businesses we acquire. So they may not at the time of the acquisition, be core to who they are, but they're also not controversial from the standpoint that they actually disagree with them. Like, there's not much disagreement, that we want to be trusting, that we want to be high integrity, that we want to do that. And those types of businesses that are not trusting have a tendency to get flushed out of our system really quickly. Really quickly, they're out. Now, the team culture is one that not every business has for sure, but we have a tendency to attract, highly team-oriented culture. Grit is a natural one for our business. All of our field people like to think of themselves as gritty and getting stuff done, and so that resonates. And then, Growth is another one that's not necessarily core to every single company that we work with, but it's not very controversial on what we're trying to do. Trying to get just a little bit better each day. That's not very controversial. And so we spend a lot of time really articulating what we are and what we're trying to be. And I think we also challenge our employees to use those core values in articulating things that they think, are working in our business or not working, in our business. Right. It gives you a language to talk about. I believe this decision wasn't in line with this core value. I believe, that, our core values would lead us to do this instead of that. Those are great conversations to have. I mean, when somebody pulls me aside and says, I don't believe, that we're living that core value, that's a really interesting, conversation to have and gives us a framework to have it. And so I think it's worked really well. And I just had, one of our newest acquisition, leaders, they've been with us a few years now, and he said, Bob, I got to say, we really, didn't believe all this stuff, that you put out there. But he says, as time's gone on, we see, how diligent the company is about executing on what its core values are. We're not perfect. We make mistakes. We have individuals that make mistakes, but it gives us a language to really talk about it, fix it, move forward. And for some people to figure out that this isn't the right place for them, and that's part of our mission is to be a great place to work. Well, I think that starts with people that want what we want. It doesn't make any sense for us to hire somebody that wants something totally different, from what we want. And we acknowledge that. And that doesn't make them bad people. This is not a value judgment that our, core values are the only way to view the lens of business. But we do want people that want those things, and I think all of that together has really helped us, to achieve, the great results that we have so far. And the results that we intend to have for generations into the future.
It was a good segue into how do you see change in your leadership style and the business of where you spend your time. So over the years, you've been in a couple different roles. I think we're all very lucky to have a CEO who's super committed to living our core values and fulfilling our mission. I know you dedicate a lot of time. How do you see your role changing and where you spend your time in creating value from the CEO seat?
Yeah, it really has changed, a lot over time. First of all, the one thing that I think is really important that is I sat in the seat of our division president. So I was running a business which was much like the businesses that they run. And I think that that's really helpful, to me to see the business through their eyes. And I think
and the challenges.
No doubt. I think that the challenges is some of the most important stuff. And I like to get involved in, some of that and get my proverbial hands dirty with the challenges that we have in our business. But really, as the business has evolved, I've seen the best place for me to spend my time as it relates to our actual operations that are part of our business today. And that's only part of my job. The other part of my job, is around the growth of the business and what we do to acquire other businesses and where we're going to acquire those and supporting those with the financial resources that they need. But as it relates to actually supporting how we operate, I believe scaling the culture of HB Global is the most important thing. So we do things like this, do podcasts where we talk about how we're going about it to align it. We go to job sites specifically to articulate, what we're about as a business, because, keep it a secret, but I'm probably not the person to be out there, judging the quality of the technical work that they're doing. It's more about what we're trying to do big picture, as a business. And so that's how I spend my time. And that's very different. I spent time, really, focused on the culture early, but I spent a lot more time, with the problem on this job, or, the resources we need to do this, whereas now it's much more about scaling this culture to the business and the activities that we do around that. And, that's how I spend the majority of my time that I think actually affects what we do on a daily basis.
And I know we all have a worldview based on our experiences throughout life. What do you use to help you articulate some of these key messages?
Well, I've gotten, I guess, I think I've picked up my worldview, starting all the way, like everyone else, through their family and the community and the things that they did, I think was very instrumental. I've talked about how team sports was a big part, but there were certain values that my parents had that I think, come out. I mean, every day I actually, have to laugh to myself, especially we're just coming off of Father's Day, laugh about some of the things where I hear my father's voice coming, out of my mouth. And, I have to laugh at myself a little bit because there would have been a day where I probably would have fought against that a little bit. But I start there, like everybody else does. But then I think from the business standpoint, it's now, I hate to, admit it, but coming up on a 35-year business career. So you see a lot, you experience a lot over those, you make a lot of mistakes. And, I think you want to learn through other people's mistakes as much as you can, but you can't learn everything.
Not everything.
Not everything can be
Something
learned.
you have to do for yourself.
Some mistakes you just have to make yourself. And hopefully you don't have to do those a bunch of times,
Right.
but you have to learn those. And then I spend a ton of time consuming, business information. So whether it be a book or a podcast or, reading, in the Wall Street Journal or annual reports of the businesses, we follow our large national competitors that are publicly traded, and we learn, a lot through what they go on, the peer groups that we have, the industry groups we're part of. That's all part of it. And I think it's part of our culture as a business to be a continual learner. That growth core value of ours, it is about growing the business, but more importantly, it's about growing ourselves personally and professionally. And the smartest people I've ever met, read a lot, consume a lot of information. Now you have to take that and you got to throw the stuff out that you think doesn't make sense, and you got to prioritize the things that you think are most important. But I think it all starts, with being exposed to that, and, being exposed to those areas, and you meet great folks along the way that, show you that this thing is really important. You need to focus on that. So I think that's, it's the combination of all of those things, that it's not just me, it's everybody in our organization, has that and their worldview. And my worldview may make a lot of sense in certain situations, but then, we have different situations with people with different skills, different, strengths are going to play better in those situations. And, hopefully we know to bring the best resources to bear in those situations.
So another topic that you've been, I'll say, sharing lately is the power of and. Do you want to talk a little bit about that messaging, why it's important to you, and where you'd like to see us go with it?
Well, I think all of us, we love the situations where you can have one variable and you maximize that variable and you get the very best result. Well, one of those things I've seen over the last 33 years or so is oftentimes when you maximize this variable, there other variable that's relatively important, maybe not as important as the one you were, maybe you had the right one you were measuring,
Right.
but there's this other one that's important too, and it negatively affects that. And so I think one of the things that I've learned over time, and Jim Collins coined it the power of and, is really keeping two ideas that in some situations, seem to actually be counter to himself, to keep them, part, of the philosophy. And I think, just there's been a few examples today of things, we talk about the sense of urgency to get things done that really need to be done today, while at the same time, really taking the actions that are going to allow us to succeed and thrive, in the long run. So, when are you more focused on the long, making the decisions that are going to impact the long run, or, maximizing the variable that, and the classic is the profit variable today.
Right.
Can you absolutely maximize the profit variable today and be doing the right things for the future? I would argue not. They are somewhat in conflict, and we're trying to find the right balance of those two things to maximize our result over, the long haul. And we view ourselves as just not being in it, for this generation, but for the generations to come. And so I think that that's a really important, for us, and, to keep in the forefront of our mind, and to be really thoughtful about it. And we won't always get it right, and to give ourselves the grace to constantly be making those adjustments, because I think we're constantly doing that, and the right decision for today may be the wrong one for tomorrow, and to realize that changes. But we think a lot about that. We think about those things, that are in conflict. Another example of the power of and, that we've talked about over time is, we think of ourselves as very people-centric. We are about our people. Well, let's take the decision, if we take a job that, say, is 100 miles away or 120 miles away. Well, that puts strain on individual employees. There's no doubt.
Right.
But if we don't take that job, we may allow a competitor to get in there and show that, they can do the job, and which puts us under, cost pressure with that customer, down the road. And so making that decision of, what's the right decision in that situation, I think is really this, this power of and.
And that's a great example.
And it can be different at different times. Again, at different times we make different choices, based on where we are at the business at the time and our resources. But I think it still gives our employee base a language to have a discussion about that. And we as leaders should be willing to explain.
Absolutely.
A big part of our philosophy on leadership is that we believe that it's part of our job, to explain to our employee owners the decisions we make.
Well, I've really enjoyed this conversation today. I think our audience is going to see a couple more of these in the future, of just leaning in a little bit to your journey over your tenure here at HB Global, and some of the key messages that you have to come. So thank you.
Well, thanks, Stacey. And just a preview of an episode to come, I think we're going to flip the script here and have you answer the questions in a coming episode. So looking forward to that.
We can do that. All right. Thanks, Bob.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. If you have questions for Bob, we'd love to hear them and answer them in future podcasts. Feel free to submit them to eopodcast@hb-global.com, and we'll see you next time.